Thank you for coming. And before I start, I wanted to tell you that when I left high school, I wanted to be a music major because I fully believed that I could make a living as a musician. What did I know, right? But I had a curiosity that I wanted to be a writer because I had the most amazing journalism teacher in high school. And so out of that curiosity, I took one journalism class in college. And that journalism class changed my life. And that's why I kind of ditched the guitar and took up the typewriter. Yes, I'm old. And became a writer. And I want to dedicate tonight to my lovely high school journalism teacher, Miss B, Margie Bettendorf, who drove from Stewart to come to see us tonight. Thank you so much, Margie. This is for you. When I was 10 months old, my parents became exiles in Miami. I was born in Cuba, in a little town called Puerto Padre. It was on the northeast tip of Cuba, of the island of Cuba, closer to Haiti than it was to Havana. It was a lovely port town, but it had a lot of countryside around it. And my parents had, it was 10 months after I was born, the revolution, the Castro Revolution had come in 17 days after I was born and had completely rolled through the whole system of government. The revolution that my parents had been supporting turned out to be the one that solidified into a totalitarian government and took away businesses and dreams, and my parents became exiles. It would be many years before they could reconnect with their loved ones, with some of their closest loved ones in Miami, who were able to leave as well. And sometimes those reconnections became very brief. I was 10 years old. I didn't meet my paternal grandmother until I was 10 years old. And when I did, she died a few years after. So this story tonight is based on the short time that we had together. And like many things Cuban, it involves sugar. Or as we say with many exclamation points in all capital letters, azúcar. Repite, por favor. Azúcar. Now, those exclamation points might have been a warning to our blood glucose levels to come, or to our rising A1C numbers. But tonight, it's about memory, the sweetness of memory, and about the bittersweet memory that I have. There were my grandmother, Maria Fernandez de Balmaseda. There were two secrets, two mysteries in her kitchen. She was one of them. She was a lovely woman of café con leche skin. She was like one of those vintage photos with dangly gold earrings with little gems in them, stoic, smiling face. I like to think of her like almost like one of the country Madonnas of those gorgeous vintage photos. And she was as talkative as those vintage photos, which means she really didn't talk very much, but she smiled a lot. She was a benign presence. I remember she had the most gorgeous hands, and she wore kind of like the silk of age, and these just beautiful, her hands were just gorgeous. I loved them best when she was stirring up my favorite dessert, which was her famous cremitas de leche. Translates to maybe milk puffs, but I don't want to leave you that impression because it was something far more glorious than that. She made the most delicious dessert out of simply 2 ingredients, and I always marveled at how did she achieve something that was so rich yet so delicate, so flavorful yet so airy. How did she achieve this with 2 ingredients, whole milk and white sugar, equal parts? That was the second mystery in her kitchen, the cremitas. How did you make them? that was enough to get me into the kitchen, 10-year-old me, into the kitchen with a grandmother I barely knew and a woman who barely spoke. And so, but the promise of having to, getting to taste the most glorious bite, that always got me in. The thing about the cremitas is, even though the elements that went into it were simple, ingredient-wise, the process was excruciating. The process to a 10-year-old felt like watching paint dry. It was so long and it was so laborious. It was very slow and very tedious. In fact, Abuela would get her favorite trusty pot, her favorite, her wooden spoon, always the same pot, always the same spoon, put her ingredients in it and settle it at the lowest of flames. And then she would stir, and she would stir, and she would stir. And it was just this constant motion, almost hypnotic motion of her stirring. This mixture, the sugar as it melted into the warming milk, the mixture as it began to lightly caramelize and just turn into its own thing. It would be watching her constantly, but however, you would see changes in this mixture. You would see changes as it thickened and as it turned a little more golden, and how it just developed its own personality. I mean, its own thing. So she would constantly stir, always waiting for what she called el punto, the point. The point being the moment when it spoke to you and it told you it was ready for the next step. That's the thing about Abuela Maria. Like, her pot spoke to her, her spoon spoke to her, the mixture that she was stirring all spoke to her. Abuela, why do you use this pot? Oh, that pot knows this recipe. It knows this recipe incredibly well. And that's why always that spoon. Oh, this spoon. There's no spoon that can stir like this particular spoon. So this was all this conversation she was having in silence with these ingredients. And I would just watch her. The punto was the moment when she would drag that wooden spoon across the bottom of the pot, and ever so fleetingly, you could see the bottom. That's what it told. That's when it told you that this mixture was caramelized or thickened enough that it was ready for the next step, which was taking it off the flame and waiting again. So there I was, asking her a million questions, hoping that the time would go faster. Abuela, how long is this going to be? Why do you use that? Why do you use this? And why do you use that? And what are you doing to those brown paper bags? Well, the brown paper bags, she would take them and she would carefully cut them open. She would line the counter with them. More anticipation, because I knew that there was an incredible step coming with those paper bags. And she would place her spoon and she would get like a shallow bowl and place it there. And then she would sit down and just smile. Just smile at me. I mean, we had no conversation, but she would just smile and I would smile back. And, but it was benign. It wasn't awkward. It was just very benign. It was beautiful. But I lived for the moment when Abuela would just get up and smooth out her skirt and return to the counter. She would take that shallow bowl and it was on. This was the moment. This was the drama coming into, I mean, like if there was a soundtrack, it would be, the drum beat behind Celia Cruz's Kimbara, Kimbara, Kumba, Kimbamba. It would be something like that. It would be this real, and she would take that and she would dollop that mixture, which by the way had changed. The mixture in that stove, as it cooled, had then shifted. It was no longer that cohesive, stirred mixture. No, it had kind of separated, and it was a little bit more splotchy, and it was like a little more golden on one side, and it looked like a mess. Seriously, I was thinking, wow, all of this for that. But okay, so she would take this and put it into the bowl, and she would whip that bowl with the wooden spoon, and it was go Abuela. Her hands were a blur. And something miraculous was happening to this mixture. It was just poofing into this whiteness like its original ingredients. It was the white of the milk and the white of the sugar and this thickness. It was very velvety. And she would take it and just drop it by spoonfuls on that brown paper, on those brown paper bags, and always careful to make the little twirl on top of every little puff, right? Just this element of finesse that she always had. And then we had to wait again. We had to wait another half hour for the darn things to cool. And they were taunting me, like they were lined up like flowers in a field, totally taunting me. But the payoff was, I got the first bite. I got to taste the first bite of those cremitas, because nobody else was in the kitchen. Nobody else could stand being there the whole time. But I did. So I got the first cremitas, which were incredible. They just kind of poofed on my tongue. They were the most, you know how sometimes when you have caramel, it sticks to your teeth, or it's none of that. This was vapor. This was the richest, most amazing vapor you want to have. And now, today, I know that it's because of the slow caramelization and then the aeration, you know, with the settling of it, and then the aeration of the whipping motion. And I'm sure that we could use very modern equipment to achieve the same thing. In fact, some of the recipes I've seen start with sweetened condensed milk, but like, what's the point? I mean, when you can condense your own milk, right? But anyway, you know, so I know now that there's like a science, but even still today, I think that there was a magic. There was an element of magic. I have to keep assuming because Abuela never told me. Abuela never told me about herself. She never spoke about herself. She was more about the vibe of being with you, of being this benign presence in your life, and just, she was a lot older, so she was very, you know, she was just very quiet, and not because she was shy, but just because that was her personality. I didn't come to know really about Abuela until after she had passed away. Years after she passed away, I just began to kind of patch things together about her life and about, you know, who were my grandparents and, you know, what were their lives like. And I remember I was a young reporter for the Miami Herald. I was a young general assignment reporter, and I was sent to the funeral of this exile leader, this elder statesman of the exile community. I don't remember the guy's name, I don't remember anything like that, but I do remember that it was one of those quintessential scenes of a Cuban funeral in Little Havana, where, you know, the elderly men were wearing the starched white linen guayaberas and drinking coffee out of the little demi-tasse, a little café cubano. And I'm not, you know, making up a stereotype. This was really the scene. I kind of worked the room and introduced myself and interviewed people. And I came upon this one cluster of elderly men, and I said, when I introduced myself, one of the men says, "Liz Balmaseda, but are you Inocencio Balmaceda's granddaughter?" I said, "Oh yeah, that was Inocencio. Yeah, Inocencio was my grandfather. He died when I was a little kid, a little baby, but yeah, that was my grandfather." I said, "Oh, Inocencio, everybody in the countryside knew Inocencio, Inocencio, what a great man he was. He was great to his children, he was great to all his women, he was a great cockfighter. This is not what a young reporter who was then covering an illegal cockfighting ring in Hialeah Gardens, co-owned by the mayor, wanted to hear. I mean, who had grown up in this country. I was like, Inocencio, how ironic. His name translates to innocence. This I knew about my grandfather, and honestly, it's probably about what I know about my grandfather now, but my grandmother had, all the stories became kind of together, melded together like a quilt. And everybody who spoke about her spoke not in those very specific terms. They spoke more about her grace and her courage and her generosity and her spirit and how wonderful she was with people, how loving she was. They lived in the countryside in Cuba, in the countryside of our town, and they were kind of country rich. My maternal grandparents were incredibly poor, but my paternal grandparents were country wealthy, and they had a farm, they had a farmhouse, they had a ranch, they had other lands. They also had a house in town. And my grandmother, in her country house, had 11 children. So my father was one of the youngest sons of 11 children. At about the same time, not too far from their country house, somewhere nearby, my grandfather had another 10 children with a woman that he would not marry. And there came a point in time when when the woman the biological mother of these children, got sick, and she wasn't able to care for them for a small amount of time. And so my grandfather brought all those kids to my grandmother. On the day that they arrived, my father's half-siblings arrived, the 10 kids and the 11 kids, my grandmother sat them all down and said, "From this day forth, you're all my children. From this day forth, you are all brothers and sisters. You will treat each other with love. You will treat each other with respect. And I don't want to hear anything. You are all brothers and sisters. Not half, and you are all brothers and sisters." And incredibly, even those kids eventually reunited with their biological mother, of course, but even years later, even many years later, they always talked about my grandmother as a maternal figure. They always talked about her with this great admiration, and they never called one another anything but brother and sister. It wasn't the things that she said, it was the actions. My grandmother was a woman of few words, but that doesn't mean she didn't have anything to say. She had a lot to say. When I think about her, and I think about the story of the cremitas, of making the cremitas, I think there's so many parallels between my grandmother and making those cremitas, because in the end, they're polished and perfect and just ethereal. But that was only after the discipline of 1,000 strokes. That was only after the patience of waiting for el punto, of waiting for that moment, and then allowing life to shift and to settle. It was only after not rushing to fill silence, but to learn that there was a meditation in cooking, that cooking brought to you a certain air of serenity and meditation. And what I learned in the longest hours of our shortest years was this: silence was not something to fear. Silence brought its own gifts. And what it brought me was serenity. And it brought me a sense of meditation. And it brought me a whole lot of sweet. And it brought a whole bunch of exclamation points. Upside down, right side up, everything. And it brought a lot of azúcar. Azúcar. Abuela, I love you. It's for you. Thank you.